Chapter number 17, Breathing and Exchange of Gases. Class 11th NCERT. As you have read earlier, oxygen is utilized by the organism to indirectly break down nutrient molecules like glucose and to derive energy for performing various activities. Carbon dioxide, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reaction. It is therefore evident that oxygen has to be continuously provided to the cell and carbon dioxide produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with carbon dioxide produced by the cells is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. Place your hands on your chest. You can feel the chest moving up and down. You know what it is due to breathing. You know that it is due to breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organs and the mechanism of breathing are described in the following sections of this chapter. Respiratory organs. Mechanism of breathing vary among different groups of animals depending mainly on their habitats and level of organization. Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelentrates, flatworms, etc. exchange oxygen with carbon dioxide by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms use their moist cuticle and insects have a network of tubes or tracheal tubes to transport atmospheric air within the body. Special vascularized structures called gills are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and mollusks, whereas vascularized bags called lungs are used by the terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among the vertebrates, fishes use gills, whereas reptiles, birds and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frogs can respire through their moist skin also. Mammals have a well-developed respiratory system. Human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to a nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, a portion of which is the common passage for food and air. The pharynx opens into the larynx region into the trachea. Larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in sound production and hence called the sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by a thin elastic cartilaginous flap called epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into the larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity which divides at the end of fifth thoracic vertebrae into a right and left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergoes repeated division to form the secondary and tertiary bronchi and bronchioles, ending up in a very thin terminal bronchioles. The trachea, primary, secondary and tertiary bronchi and initial bronchioles are supported by incomplete cartilaginous rings. Each terminal bronchiole gives rise to a number of thin, irregular, walled and vascularized bag-like structures called alveoli. The branching network of bronchi, bronchioles and alveoli comprise the lungs. Figure 17.1. We have two lungs which are covered by a double-layered pleura with the pleural fluid between them. It reduces friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lung surface. The part starting with the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and their ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clears it from the foreign particles, humidifies and also brings the air to the body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and atmospheric air. The lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, vertebrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs and on the lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. The anatomical setup of lungs in thorax is such that any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lung or pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing as we cannot directly alter pulmonary volume. Respiration involves the following steps. First, breathing or pulmonary ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and carbon dioxide rich alveolar air is released out. Diffusion of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide across alveolar membrane. Transport of gases by the blood. Diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide by blood and tissues. Utilization of oxygen by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration as dealt in chapter 14. Mechanism of breathing. Breathing involves two stages. Inspiration, during which the atmospheric air is drawn in, and expiration, by which the alveolar air is released out. The movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lung or intrapulmonary pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure. That is, there is a negative pressure in the lungs with respect to the atmospheric pressure. Similarly, expiration takes place with the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. Diaphragm and a specialized set of muscles, external and internal intercostals between the ribs, helps in generation of such gradients. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of thoracic chamber in the antero-posterior axis. The contraction of external intercostal muscle lifts up the ribs and the sternum, causing an increase in the volume of thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes a similar increase in pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from outside to move into the lungs, that is inspiration. Relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles return the diaphragm and sternum to their normal positions and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. This leads to an increase in the intrapulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing the expulsion of air from the lungs, that is expiration. We have the ability to increase the strength of the inspiration and expiration with the help of additional muscles in the abdomen. On an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movements can be estimated by using a spirometer, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary functions. Respiratory volumes and capacities. First is tidal volume or TV. Volume of air inspired or expired during a normal respiration. It is approximately 500 ml. That is, a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6,000 to 8,000 ml of air per minute. Inspiratory reserve volume or IRV. Additional volume of air a person can inspire by a forcible inspiration. This averages to 2,500 ml to 3,000 ml. Expiratory reserve volume ERV. Additional volume of air a person can expire by a forcible expiration. This averages 1000 ml to 1100 ml. Residual volume or RV. Volume of air remaining in the lungs even after a forcible expiration. This averages 1100 ml to 1200 ml. By adding up a few respiratory volumes described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities which can be used in clinical diagnosis. Respiratory capacity or IC. Inspiratory capacity or IC. Total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. This includes tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume TV plus IRV. Expiratory capacity EC. Total volume of air of a person can expire after a normal inspiration. This includes tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume TV plus ERV. Functional residual capacity or FRC. Volume of air that will remain in the lungs after a normal expiration. This includes ERV plus RV. Vital capacity, the maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forced expiration. This includes ERV, TV and IRV, or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. Total lung capacity, total volume of air accommodated in the lungs at the end of a forced inspiration. This includes RV, ERV, TV and IRV, or vital capacity plus residual volume. Exchange of gases. Alveoli are the primary sites for exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissue. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in this site by simple diffusions, mainly based on pressure or concentration gradient. Solubility of the gases as well as involved in diffusions are also some important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure and is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressures of these two gases in the atmospheric air and the two sites of diffusions are given in the table and in figure. The data in the table clearly indicates a concentration gradient of oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to tissues. Similarly, a gradient is present for carbon dioxide in the opposite direction, that is from the tissue to blood and blood to alveoli. As the solubility of carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times higher than that of oxygen, the amount of carbon dioxide that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference is in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of oxygen. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely the thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries and the basement substance in between them. However, its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to tissues and that of carbon dioxide from tissues to alveoli. Transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. About 97% of oxygen is transported by red blood cells in the blood. The remaining 3% of oxygen is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is transported by the red blood cells, whereas 70% of it is carried as a bicarbonate. About 7% of carbon dioxide is carried in a dissolved state through plasma. Transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a red colored ion containing pigment present in the red blood cells. Oxygen can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of oxygen. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is primarily related to the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against the partial pressure of oxygen. This curve is called the oxygen dissociation curve and is highly useful in studying the effect of factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, etc. on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. In the alveoli, where there is a high partial pressure of oxygen, low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, lesser hydrogen ion concentration and lower temperature, the factors are all favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. Whereas in tissues where low partial pressure of oxygen, high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, high hydrogen ion concentration and higher temperature exist, the conditions are favorable for dissociation of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin. This clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and gets dissociated at the tissues. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under normal physiological conditions. Transport of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. about 20 to 25%. This binding is related to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of oxygen is a major factor which could affect this binding. When partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high and partial pressure of oxygen is low, as in the tissues, more binding of carbon dioxide occurs whereas when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low and partial pressure of oxygen is high, as in the alveoli, dissociation of carbon dioxide from carbaminohemoglobin takes place. That is, carbon dioxide which is bound to hemoglobin from the tissues is delivered at the alveoli. Red blood cells contains a very high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and minute quantities of the same is present in the plasma too. This enzyme facilitates the following reaction in both the direction. Carbon dioxide plus H2O in the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives H2CO3. In the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives HCO3 or bicarbonate ions plus hydrogen ions. At the tissue site where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high due to catabolism, carbon dioxide diffuses into blood, RBCs and plasma and forms bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. At the alveolar site where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of carbon dioxide and water. Thus, carbon dioxide trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as carbon dioxide. Every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of carbon dioxide to the alveoli. Regulation of respiration. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demands of the body tissues. This is done by the neural system. A specialized center present in the medulla region of the brain called respiratory rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons region of the brain called pneumotaxic center can moderate the functions of the respiratory rhythm center. Neural signal from this center can reduce the duration of the inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Increase in these substances can activate this center, which in turn can signal the rhythm center to make necessary adjustments in respiratory processes by which these substances can be eliminated. Receptors associated with the aortic arch and carotid artery can also recognize changes in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration and send necessary signals to the rhythm center for remedial actions. The role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. Disorders of respiratory system. Asthma is a difficulty in breathing causing wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Emphysema is a chronic disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged, due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major causes of this is cigarette smoking. Occupational respiratory disorders. In certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope up with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation, leading to fibrosis or proliferation of fibrous tissues, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. So let us begin with the summary. Cells utilize oxygen for metabolism and produce energy along with the substances like carbon dioxide, which is harmful. Animals have evolved different mechanisms for the transport of oxygen to the cells and for the removal of carbon dioxide from there. We have a well-developed respiratory system comprising two lungs and associated air passages to perform this function. The first step in respiration is breathing, by which atmospheric air is taken in. Inspiration and the alveolar air is released out. Expiration. Exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between deoxygenated blood and alveoli. Transport of these gases throughout the body by blood. exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the oxygenated blood and tissues, and utilization of oxygen by the cells or cellular respiration are the other steps involved. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by creating pressure gradients between the atmosphere and the alveoli with the help of specialized muscles, intercostals and diaphragm. Volumes of air involved in these activities can be estimated with the help of spirometer and are of clinical significance. Exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the alveoli and tissues occur by diffusion. Rate of diffusion is dependent on the partial pressure gradients of oxygen or partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide or partial pressure of carbon dioxide, their solubility as well as the thickness of the diffusion surface. These factors in our body facilitate diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the deoxygenated blood as well as from the oxygenated blood to the tissues. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of carbon dioxide in the opposite direction, that is from the tissues to alveoli. Oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin. In the alveoli, where partial pressure of oxygen is higher, oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin, which is easily dissociated at the tissues, where partial pressure of oxygen is low and partial pressure of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentrations are high. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate, it's CO3 minus, with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. In the tissues where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, it gets bound to the blood. Alveoli, where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low and partial pressure of oxygen is high, it gets removed from the blood. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by the respiratory center in the medulla region of the brain, a pneumotaxic center in the pons region of brain, and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter respiratory mechanism. Thank you.